I never imagined a peaceful autumn evening could turn into the night I'd remember for the rest of my life. My name's Jacob Miller, and for as long as I can remember, I've been working the same stretch of land my grandfather once called his kingdom, Miller Acres, 120 acres of golden cornfields that gleamed like a sea of sunlight under the setting sun. Every year, come harvest season, those tall stalks of corn would sway in the breeze like a proud army, and I'd stand there on the edge of my porch with a cup of black coffee in hand, watching my life's work move with the rhythm of nature. Farming wasn't glamorous, and God knows it wasn't easy, but it was mine, every inch, every furrow, every kernel of corn. Until the HOA moved in next door. It started small, as these things always do. The neighboring land, once just an overgrown patch of scrub, got bought out by a development company that wanted to build a sustainable community. A fancy name for rows of identical houses and too many people with too much time on their hands. The HOA was formed before the first house was even finished, and like a weed that finds fertile ground, it spread fast. Within a year, the quiet outskirts of my farm were filled with manicured lawns, white fences, and the kind of people who'd call the city if your mailbox didn't match the neighborhood's aesthetic guidelines. I didn't think much of them at first. I figured they'd stay on their side of the fence, and I'd stay on mine. But then came her, Karen. Karen was the self-appointed queen of the HOA, a woman who treated the neighborhood charter like the Constitution and her clipboard like the Word of God. She had a voice that carried over fences, a nose that could sniff out a single untrimmed hedge, and a glare sharp enough to slice through steel. From the day she moved in, she made it clear she didn't like me, or my farm. She said it was unsightly, that the smell of manure ruined the air quality, and that my tractor made too much noise in the mornings. I tried to be polite at first, brushing off her comments with a nod and a smile, but she wasn't the kind of woman to be ignored. The more I ignored her, the more she found to complain about. First, she sent letters, formal complaints about the noise pollution from my harvesters. Then she escalated to calling the county office, trying to report my farm as a zoning violation. She even tried to get my cornfield classified as a fire hazard because the stalks were too tall and dry. It was ridiculous. That land had been producing corn since before her subdivision was even a blueprint. The county official who came out to inspect it laughed, shook my hand, and told me not to worry. But Karen didn't like being told no. Every time she failed, she found another angle to attack from. She started harassing my workers, showing up uninvited, taking pictures of my property like she was building a legal case. The final straw came 3 weeks before the harvest. I had spent months preparing for it, waking up before dawn, checking the irrigation systems, watching the corn ripen to perfection. The scent of it filled the air, sweet, earthy, alive. I could almost taste the success of the season. Then one afternoon, as I was loading tools into the shed, Karen strutted up the gravel path like she owned the place. Her perfectly ironed blouse and spotless white shoes looked absurd against the backdrop of dust and dirt. She didn't even bother with a greeting. "Mr. Miller," she said, tapping her clipboard, "I've filed my last warning with the county. Your property's proximity to our homes is a safety violation, and if you don't mow down that corn within a week, I'll take this to the HOA board, and to the fire department." I wiped my hands on my jeans and stared at her, trying to hold back a laugh. "Karen, this isn't a lawn, it's a working farm. You can't just mow down a field of corn." She glared. "You're violating community standards. It's dangerous, unsightly, and frankly, it lowers property values. People don't want to live next to this mess." I leaned against my tractor and looked her straight in the eye. "This land's been here for generations. Your HOA doesn't have jurisdiction over me or my crops. You don't get to rewrite history because you don't like the smell of dirt." That hit a nerve. Her face turned red, and for a moment, I thought she might actually explode. Instead, she just hissed, "You'll regret this, Mr. Miller. Don't say I didn't warn you." I watched her march off, her heels sinking into the gravel, her clipboard clutched like a sword. I thought that was the end of it, just another tantrum from a woman used to getting her way. But I underestimated her. Karen wasn't done. She never was. That night, I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling. I checked the locks on the barn, the fuel tanks, the silo, everything was fine. But when you've worked land this long, you start to develop instincts, a sense when something's off. The air felt heavier, like the calm before a storm. I told myself I was just overthinking it. I wasn't. 3 nights later, it happened. The moon hung low, barely a sliver in the sky, casting long shadows across the fields. The air was dry, too dry, and the wind carried the faint scent of something that didn't belong. I was half asleep when I heard the crackle. At first, I thought it was just the wind rustling through the stalks. Then I heard it again, sharper this time, followed by the unmistakable pop of fire. I jumped out of bed, threw on my boots, and ran to the porch. The sight stopped me cold. The horizon glowed an angry orange. Flames were licking up from the far edge of the cornfield, spreading fast, devouring everything in their path. The heat hit me even from that distance. My heart pounded as I raced toward the fire, shouting for my farmhand, Luke, who came running from the barn with a hose already in hand. But the flames were too fast, too strong. Within minutes, acres of my corn were engulfed, the dry stalks fueling the inferno like gasoline. I grabbed my phone and called 911, my voice shaking as I shouted our location. By the time the first fire truck arrived, the blaze had already consumed nearly a third of the field. The firefighters moved fast, setting up containment lines, spraying water in arcs that hissed against the flames. I worked beside them, desperate, helpless, covered in sweat and ash. Hours later, when the last embers finally died, I stood in the middle of what was once my livelihood, now nothing but charred earth and smoke. My entire harvest, gone. The fire marshal came over, clipboard in hand, his face grim. "We found traces of accelerant near the east fence line," he said quietly. This wasn't natural. Someone started this. My stomach dropped. I didn't need to guess who. Karen's property backed right up to that eastern fence. And as the first light of dawn broke over the smoldering field, I saw something glinting in the ashes, a melted fragment of white plastic with gold letters still faintly visible. It was the corner of a nameplate. HOA President, Karen W. And in that moment, I knew, she hadn't just crossed the line. She'd burned it to the ground. The morning after the fire felt like waking up in a nightmare I couldn't escape. The smell of burnt corn hung in the air like a curse, thick and bitter, clinging to everything it touched. My boots crunched over the blackened soil as I walked the perimeter of what used to be my pride and joy, rows of gold now reduced to ashes. The sun rose weakly through a haze of smoke, its light dull and lifeless, as if it, too, mourned the loss of my harvest. I could still hear the echoes of the firefighters' voices from the night before, their shouts mixing with the roar of the blaze. Every sound felt burned into my memory. Luke showed up just after sunrise, his face gray from exhaustion and soot. He handed me a coffee from the thermos he'd salvaged from the truck. "Whole field's gone, boss," he muttered. The east fence line was the starting point, just like the marshal said. I nodded, staring at the faint glimmer of melted plastic still embedded in the dirt where the flames had first ignited. That little piece of white, once part of Karen's precious HOA sign, might as well have been her fingerprint on the crime. But I didn't say it out loud. Not yet. I needed proof, hard, undeniable proof, before I made any move. I knew Karen. She'd spin her web of lies faster than I could blink, and if I accused her without evidence, she'd turn the whole HOA against me before the ashes even cooled. I spent the next few hours walking through the wreckage, taking photos, collecting samples of the melted debris, and marking the spots where the fire marshal had said accelerant was found. Diesel fuel, most likely. I knew that smell better than anyone. It wasn't something you'd mistake for anything else. Whoever started this fire didn't just want to scare me, they wanted to destroy me. By noon, the county sheriff arrived with 2 deputies. Sheriff Dalton had been a friend of my family for years. A big man with a calm voice and eyes that missed nothing. He shook my hand and surveyed the damage with a slow whistle. "Hell of a thing, Jacob," he said quietly. "We've had dry spells before, but nothing like this." The marshal told me he's certain it was arson. I nodded grimly. "East fence line. My guess is someone jumped the boundary. There's no sign of a break-in anywhere else." Dalton crouched, picking up the same melted plastic I'd found earlier. He turned it over in his hand, raising an eyebrow. "This was part of one of those HOA signs, wasn't it?" "Yep," I said. "And I can tell you exactly which one it was." He gave me a knowing look. "Karen?" I didn't have to answer. He sighed, rubbing his jaw. "Figures. She's been a thorn in your side since that development went up. You got any cameras out here?" "Only the ones by the barn and main gate." I didn't think I'd need them facing the fields, I admitted. "But the barn camera might have caught something." He nodded. "Pull the footage. I'll send a tech to help extract it. If we find her anywhere near your property line that night, that'll be enough to start an investigation." After they left, I went straight to the barn and pulled up the footage. The first few hours were uneventful, just darkness, with the occasional flicker of headlights from the road in the distance. Then, around 11:47 p.m., movement appeared in the far corner of the frame. A small figure, crouched near the fence line, holding what looked like a gas can. The camera didn't catch the face clearly, too much distance, too much shadow, but the posture, the build, even the hairstyle, it all looked painfully familiar. I paused the video and zoomed in. My chest tightened. It was her. Karen. Wearing her signature beige jacket and white sneakers, crouched by the fence like a thief in the night. The footage wasn't perfect, but it was clear enough to make any jury raise an eyebrow. And the timestamp lined up exactly with the fire marshal's timeline. I saved the footage, made multiple copies on separate drives, and drove straight to the sheriff's office. Dalton was in his office when I arrived, sipping coffee and going over paperwork. I didn't say a word, I just set the USB drive on his desk. He plugged it in, and we watched the video together. When it ended, he leaned back in his chair with a low whistle. "Well," he said slowly, "that's about as close to a smoking gun as we're gonna get without her holding a match." I crossed my arms. "What happens now?" He leaned forward, his expression serious. "We'll bring her in for questioning. But you know how these things go, she's not going to admit anything. Still, with this footage, the accelerant samples, and the melted sign, we've got a strong case." I nodded, though I could already feel the storm brewing. Karen wasn't going to take this quietly. She'd fight, she'd lie, and she'd play the victim, that was her nature. But for once, I had the truth on my side. Later that evening, I was sitting on the porch when I heard the sound of sirens. They weren't heading toward my farm this time, they were going the other way. Toward the subdivision. I didn't need to guess where they were stopping. Through the thin line of trees, I could see the flashing red and blue lights reflect off the white facades of the HOA homes. Within minutes, half the neighborhood had spilled onto the streets, whispering, pointing, clutching their phones. And there she was, Karen, standing on her porch in her robe, her face pale under the flashing lights, trying to argue with the deputies. Even from that distance, I could see her hands trembling as they guided her down the steps and toward the squad car. She was shouting something, gesturing wildly toward my farm, but the deputies ignored her. I sat there in silence, watching as they placed her in the back seat and drove off. For the first time in months, the night air felt calm. But that calm didn't last long. The next morning, the headlines hit like wildfire, HOA president arrested in connection to local farm arson. The story spread fast, too fast. News crews showed up at the edge of my property, their vans lining the road like vultures waiting for a carcass. They wanted interviews, sound bites, footage of the charred field. I refused most of them, but the attention was unavoidable. Karen's name was everywhere, and so was mine. Her husband, Greg, came by later that afternoon. I'd seen him a few times before, quiet man, always looking like he lived in the shadow of his wife. He stood at my gate for a long time before finally calling out. "Jacob," he said softly, "can we talk?" I nodded and met him halfway. He looked tired, embarrassed, his eyes red like he hadn't slept. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice breaking. "I didn't know what she was planning. I swear I didn't." I believed him. Greg never struck me as the type to go along with her schemes. "You didn't light the fire, Greg," I said quietly. "She did." He nodded slowly. "She's been different lately. Obsessive. Said she was going to teach you a lesson." I thought she meant another complaint, another meeting. "Not this." He wiped his eyes, voice cracking. "I just wanted you to know, whatever happens, I'll testify." I saw her leave that night. I heard her come back hours later, reeking of smoke. That sealed it. Between Greg's statement, the footage, and the physical evidence, the sheriff had everything he needed. The next few days were a blur of investigation reports, insurance calls, and endless questions. My insurance company confirmed what I already suspected: the damage was total. My entire harvest was lost, the soil scorched, and the equipment near the eastern fence melted beyond repair. The financial hit was devastating. That crop had been my biggest investment of the year. Without it, I was staring down losses I might never recover from. Still, I refused to give Karen the satisfaction of seeing me broken. I threw myself into rebuilding, clearing the burnt debris, ordering new supplies, and preparing the soil for the next planting. The neighbors from farther out, the ones who actually respected the land, came to help. They brought equipment, food, even money. For the first time in a long while, I felt the strength of a real community, not the kind that hid behind HOA rules, but the kind built on hard work and loyalty. Meanwhile, Karen's life unraveled. The HOA board removed her from her position within days of her arrest. The residents who once feared her now treated her name like poison. Rumors spread that she'd been obsessed with me, that she hated seeing old land hold power next to her modern community. Some even claimed she tried to frame me before, planting complaints and fake citations. The facade of control she'd built for years crumbled overnight. When her court date finally came, the entire town seemed to show up. I sat in the front row, dressed in my cleanest jeans and a pressed shirt, while Karen was led into the courtroom in handcuffs. She looked smaller somehow, her hair unkempt, her arrogance gone. For the first time, she seemed human. Scared. The prosecutor laid out the evidence piece by piece: the accelerant traces, the melted sign, the footage, Greg's testimony. Every detail painted the same picture: a woman consumed by spite, who'd let her obsession drive her to destroy what she couldn't control. Karen tried to defend herself, claiming it was all circumstantial, that the video wasn't clear, that her husband was lying out of revenge. But the jury wasn't buying it. When the verdict was read, guilty on all counts of arson, property destruction, and reckless endangerment, she broke down. Tears streamed down her face as the judge sentenced her to 5 years in state prison and ordered full restitution for the damages. I didn't smile. I didn't celebrate. I just sat there, staring at her, the woman who tried to ruin me and ended up destroying herself. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed around me again, shoving microphones in my face, asking how I felt. I said only one thing: fire destroys what it touches. Sometimes it burns crops. Sometimes it burns pride. And then I walked away. But deep down, I knew this wasn't the end. The land could heal. The corn could grow again. But the scars, both on the soil and in my soul, would take much longer to fade. Spring came slower that year, like the earth itself was hesitant to wake up after the long, cold shadow of what had happened. The blackened soil, still bearing the scars of the fire, seemed reluctant to breathe again. Every time I stepped onto the field, I could still smell faint traces of smoke hidden beneath the fresh layer of dirt, a grim reminder of what Karen had done. But I refused to let the past hold me prisoner. My grandfather used to say, a man's worth isn't measured by what he loses, but by what he rebuilds. So I rebuilt. The insurance money finally came through, though it wasn't nearly enough to cover everything. Still, with the community's help and a loan from the local agricultural cooperative, I managed to start again. Luke and I spent weeks turning over the earth, plowing deep, working the soil until it began to feel alive again. The wind carried away the ash, and little by little, green began to return. When I dropped the first seed of the new season into the ground, I whispered a quiet promise to myself, this time, nothing will take it away from me. Life around me began to shift, too. The HOA community across the fence line changed overnight after Karen's downfall. The once pristine neighborhood, known for its endless rules and overzealous inspections, suddenly grew quiet. Without her iron grip, the residents realized how much of their lives had been controlled by fear and vanity. Some even came by to apologize for not speaking up when she tormented me. I didn't hold grudges, at least, not against them. Karen had been the poison in their well, and now that she was gone, they were trying to clean it out. One morning, as I was repairing the irrigation system, a car pulled into my driveway, a sleek silver sedan that looked out of place among the dust and dirt. A woman stepped out, carrying a folder and wearing a nervous smile. "Mr. Miller?" she asked softly. "Depends who's asking," I said, wiping my hands on a rag. "My name's Sarah Walsh. I'm the new president of the Willow Creek HOA." I raised an eyebrow. Didn't think anyone would volunteer for that job after what happened. She gave a small laugh. "Believe me, I didn't volunteer. The board kind of pushed it on me. I just wanted to come by and say that things are going to be different now. We've dissolved half the old bylaws, and the board voted to establish a partnership with local landowners. We want to make peace with the community we live next to." I studied her for a moment, looking for the hidden angle, but she seemed genuine. "Partnership, huh?" "Yes," she said, opening the folder and handing me a set of papers. "We're proposing a community farmers market. You could sell your produce directly to the neighborhood, build a bridge, so to speak. People want to reconnect after everything that's happened. They feel guilty." I took the papers but didn't promise anything. "I'll think about it," I said. She smiled, nodded, and left without another word. For days, I mulled over her offer. Part of me wanted to say no, to draw a line in the dirt and keep that neighborhood as far away from my land as possible. But another part of me, the part that still believed in second chances, saw an opportunity. Maybe this was the universe's way of turning ashes into something new. So I agreed. By late summer, the corn stood tall again, bright and alive, the kind of sight that made your chest swell with pride. The community market idea took off faster than I expected. Every Saturday, families from the HOA and nearby farms came together, selling everything from homemade jams to hand-carved wood crafts. The once hostile line between us and them began to blur. Kids ran through the fields laughing, and for the first time in years, the land felt joyful again. Still, even with the peace returning, I couldn't shake the shadows completely. Karen might have been gone, but her ghost lingered, not in a supernatural sense, but in the quiet whispers and the awkward silences when people mentioned her name. Some of the new residents didn't even know the story, but those who had lived through it avoided the subject entirely. It was like the community wanted to erase her from memory, to pretend the fire had burned her existence away along with the crops. But life doesn't work like that. Then, one morning, almost a year after the fire, I received a letter in the mail, no return address, just my name written in neat, familiar handwriting. I recognized it instantly. My stomach tightened as I opened it. Jacob, I don't expect forgiveness, but I need you to understand, I never meant for it to go that far. I thought it would be small, just a warning, just to scare you. But it got out of control. I lost everything, and maybe that's what I deserved. But I want you to know that I'm trying to make peace with what I did. I see your farm in my dreams, still burning, and I can't breathe. Please, don't let hate rot your heart like it did mine. Karen and I sat on the porch for a long time, staring at that letter. My first instinct was anger, that she had the nerve to reach out after everything she'd done. But the longer I read it, the more I realized it wasn't arrogance that had driven her this time. It was regret. Real, painful regret. And maybe, just maybe, she was trying to make things right in the only way she knew how. I didn't write back. There was nothing left to say. But for the first time, I felt something I hadn't in months, closure. Weeks later, news broke that Karen had been released early for good behavior. The town buzzed with speculation, but I didn't pay much attention. I figured she'd move away, start fresh somewhere else, and that'd be the end of it. But life, I've learned, has a strange way of circling back when you least expect it. One humid afternoon, as I was setting up for the weekend market, a small crowd gathered at the edge of the lot. I looked up to see a woman standing there, friendlier than I remembered, her hair streaked with gray, her eyes tired but kind. Karen. The crowd fell silent. People stared, whispering. Some looked angry, others just shocked. She clutched a paper bag in her hands, her knuckles white. Slowly, she walked toward me. Jacob, she said quietly, stopping a few feet away. I didn't mean to cause a scene. I wanted to say thank you. I frowned. For what? For not letting that fire be the end, she said, her voice trembling. You could have let it destroy you, but you didn't. You rebuilt. You grew something good out of something terrible. I needed to see it. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The only sound was the rustling of the corn in the breeze. I don't hate you anymore, Karen, I said finally. But I can't forget what you did. She nodded, eyes glistening. I don't expect you to. I just wanted to see the farm once more before I leave. I'm moving to another state, starting over. She handed me the paper bag and turned to go. I opened it after she walked away. Inside was a small, wooden plaque, hand-carved, rough around the edges, but carefully made. It read, "From ashes, new roots grow." I stood there for a long time, staring at it, the past and present colliding in my chest. For the first time, I felt something close to peace. The farmers' market became a symbol of that peace. People from the HOA began helping on the farm during harvest season. Kids volunteered for tours, learning how corn was grown and harvested. What used to be a line of division turned into a bridge of understanding. The old fence that once separated my land from theirs was taken down entirely. Where the burnt boundary once stood, I planted a line of oak trees, strong, resilient, unshakable. Every year, I visit that line of trees and think about how far we've come. The scars of the fire are still there if you look closely, faint, but real. And maybe that's the point. Scars don't mean you're broken. They mean you've survived. Sometimes, at sunset, I sit on my porch with a cup of coffee, watching the light spill across the golden fields. And in the distance, if the wind is just right, I can almost hear the faint laughter of the kids from the neighborhood, playing among the stalks. It's strange how life works. The woman who once tried to destroy my world ended up teaching me the most important lesson of all: forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting, it means choosing to keep living. And I did. I lived. I rebuilt. And this time, I made sure no one could ever burn it down again. The years rolled by like the turning of the seasons, and before I knew it, 3 harvests had come and gone since that terrible night. Miller Acres had transformed from a burnt wasteland into one of the most admired farms in the entire county. The story of the fire, and what came after, became something of a legend around here. People still whispered about the man who rebuilt from ashes, and every time I heard it, I just smiled quietly to myself. Because that's all it was, a story. A story about pain, stubbornness, and, somehow, redemption. My new crops grew stronger than ever. After the fire, I invested in better irrigation systems, solar-powered water pumps, and soil enrichment techniques that helped restore the land faster than I'd ever hoped. I even switched part of the field to organic produce, something my father would have called city nonsense, but which turned out to be a goldmine. The community farmers market I'd agreed to join years earlier had evolved into a full-scale county fair every summer. Thousands came to buy local produce, crafts, and food. Families would wander the same paths where fire once raged, now lined with colorful stalls and children's laughter. It wasn't just my farm anymore, it was a symbol of resilience. Luke, my loyal farmhand, became more like a brother. Together, we expanded Miller Acres to include a small education center. We called it the Renewal Project, a place where young farmers and students could learn about sustainable agriculture, fire prevention, and soil recovery. Local schools began sending kids for tours, and soon, we had support from the State Agricultural Board. I never planned to become some kind of advocate, but I found purpose in teaching others how to rebuild what's been lost. Maybe that was my way of giving back, or maybe it was how I kept the ghosts quiet. I remember one morning in particular. The sun had just risen, casting soft gold across the fields. A group of children were walking through the rows of corn, led by Sarah Walsh, the same woman who had taken over as HOA president. She'd become one of my closest allies. Her patience and kindness had helped mend the rift between the neighborhood and the farmers. The partnership we'd built grew beyond just trade, it became friendship. We even started a shared emergency response fund between the HOA and the local farms, ensuring that if disaster ever struck again, no one would stand alone. As I watched those kids run through the fields, one of them, a little boy with a straw hat far too big for his head, stopped and looked up at me. "Mr. Miller," he said, "is it true your farm burned down before?" His teacher looked horrified, ready to scold him for asking, but I just smiled. "Yeah, son. It's true." He frowned, looking around. "But it's all fine now." "That's right," I said, crouching beside him. "Sometimes things have to burn before they can grow again." The boy seemed to think about that for a long time before nodding seriously. Then he ran off to join the others, laughing. I stood there watching him disappear into the corn and felt something in me settle, like a wound that had finally, truly healed. That evening, after everyone had gone, I sat on the porch and opened my old journal. I kept one ever since the fire, not for anyone else, but for me. Inside were years of entries, about rebuilding, about loss, about the little moments that made me believe again. But that night, I wrote something different. The fire didn't take my farm. It gave it back to me, in a new way. It burned away everything I thought I was, leaving behind only what truly mattered. When I closed the journal, I felt peace. Real, lasting peace. A few months later, I received a letter from the National Agricultural Resilience Council. At first, I thought it was junk mail, but as I read it, my hands began to tremble. They wanted to recognize Miller Acres with the Rebirth Award, a national honor given to landowners who rebuilt after catastrophic loss. My farm, my once burned, once forgotten patch of earth, was about to be honored in Washington, D.C. When I told Luke, he nearly dropped his coffee. "You're kidding," he shouted. "They're flying you out there. Like, the president's gonna shake your hand kind of thing." I laughed. Something like that. A week later, I was on a plane, the first flight I'd taken in nearly 20 years. As I looked down from the window, watching the patchwork of fields spread out beneath me, I thought about everything that had led me here. The fire. The rebuilding. Karen. Her letter. The oak trees I'd planted along the old fence line. Every piece of it felt connected, like each pain had been a seed that needed time to grow into something bigger. The award ceremony was surreal. I stood in a room filled with senators, farmers, scientists, and journalists. When they called my name, I walked up to the stage, feeling the weight of the journey behind every step. The host handed me a plaque engraved with the words, "For proving that even from ashes, life can grow stronger." As I looked out at the crowd, I realized the story wasn't just about me anymore. It was about everyone who's ever lost something they thought they could never get back, and found a way to rebuild. When I returned home, the whole town held a celebration. The mayor gave a speech, local musicians played, and the HOA, yes, the same one that had once waged war against me, set up a stage right at the border of our properties. Sarah gave a heartfelt speech, talking about unity and redemption. And when she finished, she handed me a small wooden box. Inside was the same plaque Karen had given me years ago, "From ashes, new roots grow." Only now, it had been polished and mounted on a stone base. Beneath it, a brass plate read, "In memory of change, forgiveness, and the strength to begin again." I didn't realize I was crying until Luke clapped me on the shoulder. "Guess even tough old farmers got hearts, huh?" he said with a grin. I laughed through the tears. "Don't tell anyone." That night, long after the crowd had gone home and the lanterns had burned low, I walked to the edge of the oak line, those tall, proud trees now stretching high above me. I traced my hand over the bark of the oldest one, the first I'd planted after the fire. The air was still, the stars bright. And then I saw her. A figure standing just beyond the trees, near the road, faint in the moonlight, but unmistakable. Karen. She didn't come closer. She just stood there for a moment, watching. Then, slowly, she lifted her hand and waved. A quiet, almost sorrowful wave. And then she turned and disappeared down the road. I didn't chase her. I didn't need to. Because in that moment, I understood something, she wasn't haunting me anymore. She was saying goodbye. From that night on, I never saw her again. But sometimes, when the wind blows through the fields just right, I hear a faint whisper among the corn, not of anger or guilt, but of peace. That year's harvest was the best I'd ever had. The corn grew taller than any before, golden and strong, swaying in unison like an ocean of forgiveness. People came from towns over to see the miracle field, as they called it. To me, though, it wasn't a miracle. It was just life, the way it always comes back, no matter how many times it's burned. When I stood at the edge of that field, watching the sun sink low, I thought about everything I'd lost, and everything I'd gained. The fire that once symbolized destruction had become the very thing that renewed me. And I realized then that sometimes, it takes losing everything to understand what truly matters. Years passed, quietly and kindly, the way good years often do when a man has made peace with his land and himself. The days at Miller Acres followed a rhythm I could almost feel in my bones: sunrise coffee on the porch, the hum of tractors in the distance, Luke's familiar laughter echoing across the fields, and the sound of wind moving gently through the rows of corn that had once been nothing but ashes. The scars of the past had long since blended into the soil, just like the lessons they'd carried. I was getting older now, slower in my steps, grayer around the edges, but content. My hands still bore the marks of a working man, cracked, weathered, strong. Each scar told a story. Some from barbed wire, some from machinery, and one, a long, faint burn along my left arm, from the night the fire came. I used to hate that mark. Now I saw it as proof that I'd lived through the kind of storm most men only read about. Proof that I'd been broken and built back stronger. The farm was thriving. We'd expanded into new crops, sunflowers, soybeans, and a section for community gardens where local families could plant their own produce. Kids who once came here on school trips now brought their own children to visit. They'd run through the fields, laughing, the same way they did when Sarah brought them years ago. Sometimes they'd stop to help me pull weeds or feed the chickens, and I'd tell them stories about the land. Not about the fire, not anymore, but about how hard work, patience, and forgiveness could grow anything if you gave it time. Luke eventually got married to a schoolteacher named Mary. They built a small house near the southern border of the farm, close enough that I could still see their porch light at night. Their first child, a little girl named June, was born on the anniversary of the fire, a strange, beautiful coincidence that felt like the universe had a sense of humor after all. When she was old enough to walk, June followed me everywhere. She'd toddle behind me in her tiny overalls, clutching a toy trowel like it was the most important tool in the world. She'd point to the corn and ask, "Jacob, why does it grow so tall?" And I'd smile and say, "Because it remembers what it came from, little one. It remembers the fire." One summer evening, as the sun painted the sky in shades of orange and violet, I took June to the edge of the field where the oak trees stood, the same ones I'd planted as a symbol of renewal. The biggest one now towered high above us, strong and wide, its branches spreading out like open arms. I placed my hand against its trunk and felt the rough bark under my palm, warm from the sun. This tree, I told her, was the first thing I planted after the fire. When I thought everything was gone, this was the start of it all. June looked up at me, her big blue eyes full of wonder. "Was it hard?" she asked. "Harder than I can explain," I said softly. "But sometimes, the hardest things we do are the ones that make us who we are." She nodded, though I could tell she didn't fully understand yet. She would, someday. Later that year, Sarah retired from the HOA, and they elected a new president, a young man named Caleb who'd grown up hearing stories about the farmer who forgave. Under his leadership, the relationship between the HOA and the farming community became stronger than ever. Together, we started an annual event called Harvest of Hearts, a festival where all profits went to help local families rebuild after disasters. Funny thing, the very idea came from Karen's original suggestion years ago, the one buried in her apology letter. Life has a way of circling back on itself like that, turning pain into purpose. By the time I hit 70, I knew I couldn't run the farm forever. My knees creaked, my back ached, and Luke had taken on most of the heavy lifting. I still managed the books, oversaw the machinery maintenance, and walked the fields every evening, checking the crops like I always had. That quiet walk at dusk was my prayer, my meditation. One of those evenings, I stopped by the old oak again. The wind was gentle, carrying with it the scent of earth and corn pollen. I sat beneath that tree and closed my eyes. The sounds of the farm, the hum of distant tractors, the soft rustle of leaves, the occasional bark of Luke's dog, filled the air. And then I heard another sound. Footsteps. When I opened my eyes, I saw a woman standing there, not young anymore, her hair silver, her eyes soft but haunted. Karen. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Time seemed to freeze between us. The years had changed her, she looked smaller somehow, more fragile, but her gaze was steady. "I heard you got the national award," she finally said, her voice trembling slightly. "Congratulations." "Thank you," I replied, keeping my tone gentle. She looked around the field. "It's beautiful. You did everything you said you would." I nodded. "And you? How have you been?" She gave a small, sad smile. "Trying to make things right. I started volunteering, wildfire recovery, mostly. Feels like, maybe that's how I can pay back what I did." I studied her for a long moment. The woman who once tried to destroy me now spent her days saving others from the same kind of loss. Life, it seemed, had humbled her, just as it had once humbled me. "You don't owe me anything anymore, Karen," I said finally. "The debt's been paid a long time ago." Tears welled up in her eyes, and she nodded. I just needed to see it with my own eyes. The life that came after the fire. She reached into her bag and pulled out something wrapped in cloth. "I thought you might want this," she said, handing it to me. When I unwrapped it, my breath caught in my throat. It was my father's old brass compass, the one I'd lost the night of the fire. The edges were blackened, but the needle still pointed north. I found it in the rubble, she whispered. I kept it all these years. I don't know why. Maybe I wasn't ready to let go until now. I stared at the compass, feeling a lump rise in my throat. Thank you, I said softly. She smiled through her tears, then turned to leave. As she walked down the dirt road, the setting sun cast her shadow long behind her, a quiet figure fading into the light. And just like that, she was gone again. That night, I placed the compass on my desk beside the plaque that read "From ashes, new roots grow." The two pieces, once symbols of pain, now sat side by side, reminders of how far life can bend without breaking. The next few years passed in peace. Luke took over most operations, and June grew taller, smarter, and more curious. She reminded me of myself at her age, stubborn, hardworking, and full of dreams. One evening, she came to me with an idea. She wanted to turn part of the land into a research plot for regenerative farming, to study how burned soil could be restored naturally. I couldn't help but laugh. You're going to make this old farmer proud, kiddo. By the time I reached my late 70s, I knew my time was nearing its twilight. My steps were slower, my mornings quieter. But my heart was full. I spent my last seasons the way I wanted, sitting on the porch, watching the sun rise over fields of gold, listening to the laughter of Luke's family echoing across the farm. On my 81st birthday, the whole town gathered for one final Harvest of Hearts festival. People came from all around, bringing photos, stories, and memories. The mayor gave a speech, calling me the man who turned fire into life. I laughed, a little embarrassed, but deeply touched. As the evening faded, fireworks lit up the sky, their colors reflecting off the fields. June stood beside me, holding my hand. Someday, she whispered, I'll take care of it, all of this. I looked at her, my eyes misting over. It's already yours, sweetheart. It always has been. That night, long after the last guest had left, I walked one final time to the oak trees. The moon hung low and bright. The farm was silent, except for the soft rustle of the leaves. I sat beneath that old tree and placed the compass in the dirt at its base. Thank you, I whispered, to the land, to the past, to every soul that had shaped my journey. A gentle breeze passed through the branches, and I closed my eyes, feeling the earth's heartbeat beneath me. And somewhere, far off in the distance, or maybe deep within myself, I could almost hear it again, the faint, crackling echo of fire, but this time, it wasn't destruction. It was warmth. Renewal. Life. The fire that once tore everything apart had become the light that guided everything forward. When the morning came, the sun rose over Miller Acres like it always did, golden, alive, eternal. And though my chair sat empty on the porch, my legacy was still there, growing tall in every stalk of corn, every root of oak, every life touched by the story of a man who refused to let the fire win. Because in the end, the truth was simple, the land remembers, and forgiveness grows like sunlight. And from ashes, new roots will always rise.